Hey everyone, welcome to the Politics of Information webinar series funded by SSHRC, organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice, featuring speakers researching information, surveillance, and power in the digital and pandemic age. The Center for Access to Information and Justice focuses on public interest research and the use of access to information in social science. Please check out the CAGE website and let us know if you're interested in getting involved. I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Winnipeg is located on ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that our water in Winnipeg is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Thanks to the UW event team and media team for working on this webinar series. Format for today, we're going to hear from our speaker for 25-30 minutes. And then there'll be time for questions. If you do have a question, pop your question into the chat below. And let me introduce today's speaker. Professor Darren Byler is a sociocultural anthropologist whose teaching and research examines the dispossession of stateless populations through forms of contemporary capitalism and colonialism in China, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. His monograph, Terror Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession, and Masculinity in a Chinese City, with Duke University Press 2021, examines emerging forms of media, infrastructure, economics, and politics in the Uyghur homeland. The book, which is based on 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork among Uyghur and Han internal male migrants, argues that Chinese authorities and technologists have made Uyghurs the object of terror capitalism, and his current research follows up on this argument to consider how contemporary capitalism and colonialism is traveling through digital infrastructural systems from China to Malaysia. So Darren, thanks for being here. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor. And before I get started, I'll just say that I'm speaking to you from Coast Salish lands out here in Vancouver, and talking about colonialism in another context. So let's see here. Can you all see my screen okay? Okay. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, some of the main points of my book, some of the takeaways of my book. There's a lot more I can say that I won't be able to today, but if some of the things I touch on and don't get to in detail are of interest to you, you can follow up in the Q&A or later on. So this book, Terror Capitalism, is my first sort of scholarly monograph, and really emerges out of my dissertation fieldwork, which was done between 2010 and 2018. 25 months living in Northwest China, where I learned Uyghur, learned Chinese. I'd studied for a long time before doing the fieldwork, but you get fluent in the language when you hang out with people and use it every day. And that's what I was doing for this fieldwork, trying to understand how migrants who are coming to this city in Northwest China, why they were coming and what kind of life they were finding. And as I discovered through the research, what was really being built was kind of a new sequence in racialized surveillance capitalism, a way of targeting and sorting population, collecting their data, and using it to make them productive as workers, and using their data in productive ways as well. So capital is being accrued in a bunch of different ways. And this is all linked up to the global war on terror. Uyghurs are a Turkic Muslim group, around 12 million people, and are the target of China's war on terror. The primary argument of the book, beyond sort of situating it in that the scholarship on surveillance capitalism and racialized capitalism, is to show how Uyghur social reproduction, the way that Uyghurs build their future, is being subtracted through processes of enclosure, devaluation, and dispossession. And enclosure means material enclosure and digital enclosure, the same in terms of devaluation and in relation to dispossession. Just to give you some background of the situation of this research, Northwest China, the area where all of these arrows are pointing, is the Uyghur homeland. It has been their ancestral lands for thousands of years, and it's also part of contemporary China. Prior to the 1990s, Uyghurs lived fairly autonomously in this region, but as China was becoming a manufacturer for the world, developing an export-oriented capitalist economy, they needed raw materials to drive that economy, and the Uyghur region is a source of around 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas, and around 85% of Chinese cotton. To get access to those resources, infrastructure was necessary, roads and pipelines and so on. So initially, that's what the settler population was building. Then they began to develop corporate industrial agriculture, mostly focused on cotton. This produced a sort of material displacement of the Uyghur population and a process of dispossession. The cost of living began to rise, but Uyghurs were excluded from the lucrative aspects of the economy, from the natural resource sector. They were pushed out of their own institutions, the school system, the banking system, all of the things that before they had kind of autonomously had control over. Even during the Maoist period, Uyghurs had lived autonomously in this space. That produced an antagonism, protests, violence, which the state would refer to as separatism initially, and then after 2001 as terrorism. It also meant that Uyghurs had to find a way forward, a way to live their lives, and that meant migrating. It meant leaving villages and going to the city. It also meant utilizing new networks, which were being built in 2011 as part of the infrastructure project, 3G networks, which arrived in 2011 as I started my fieldwork, and that linked Uyghurs up with each other across this large region. And with the world. So Uyghurs began to connect with people abroad, in Turkey, in Egypt, the Muslim world more generally. But primarily they were interested in using technology as a way of finding a better life. So everyone in 2011 was buying these smartphones for the first time. And over time, I began to realize that really what's happening here is a process of digital enclosure, in which social relations and the mind are being sort of excavated through data valence tools that are looking at data that's being produced by a social group or population. And eventually then it begins to extend the logic of the factory or workhouse to encompass spaces of leisure and consumption domesticity. This is surveillance capitalism's basic argument. But I sourced this not in Zuboff's work, but instead in Mark Andreevich, who was writing about this in 2007 already. What's happening in this context is, because it's a colonial context, over time, the space of the internet, the space of the digital became a space to make epistemic and material violence automated and scalable in very intimate and banal ways, which is something I'll spend most of the rest of the talk thinking through. But before I get to that, so there was a lot of migration happening, and this is what I was studying: is why are these migrants coming to the city? What kind of life are they finding? How does digital technology figure in that experience? A lot of them said that they came to the city for work, but also for religious freedom. They said that in the countryside, there's a lot of human surveillance. Everyone knows if you go to the mosque or not, but in the city, there's more anonymity, and so we could go to the mosque and not worry as much about the surveillance. Although there is cameras in these mosques, and they know that the imams that teach in the mosque is a state worker whose teachings are censored. And so a lot of people would say real Islam is happening on our smartphone rather than in the mosque. The mosque is the space of ritual Islam, but real Islam is on our smartphone, and it's being shared through SD cards, Bluetooth technology, and also a new app called WeChat, which has now become a kind of super app, but at the time was more like a WhatsApp type of app. It's owned by a Chinese company called Tencent. and really took the place of Facebook and Twitter after they were banned in 2009 in China. Uyghurs used this app in a pretty particular way to them, which meant that they used the oral speech function, sending voice memos to each other as a way of circumventing censorship, but also simply because they didn't have the computer literacy to type in Chinese. They didn't have a keyboard in Uyghur language, which is uses an Arabic script. And so they use their own language to sort of hack the censorship system of the state. And this is also what enabled them to become linked up with broader Muslim teaching networks. In May 2014, the state declared the People's War on Terror in relation to what they saw as the transformation of the Uyghur population, and also several violent incidents carried out by Uyghurs that attacked targeted Chinese civilians. One of them was in a train station called in Kunming, which is a city in southwest China, which was referred to as China's 9/11. And so in the neighborhoods where I was living at the time, these posters went up everywhere saying it's no longer permitted for people to dress in ways that we view as foreign Islam or extremist Islam. These are now signs of terrorism, kind of a latent terrorism. Instead, you can dress in sort of culturally approved costumes, ethnic costumes, which the state would say is not religious. And over time, actually, these markers of difference also were outlawed in most cases. So the People's War on Terror is going on. It targets the people who carry out violence and those that support him, but it also begins to target the entire population of Muslims themselves. So the response from the state is not justified by the crime. The crime of maybe several hundred people is associated with 12 million. And it begins really with a sort of a reference to counterinsurgency theory and full spectrum intelligence. It begins with a mapping of the entire population, a sorting of that population. To get there, they needed to build alliances between state security and private industry. This is also a moment in time in mid-2010s when there's many breakthroughs in machine learning and computer vision AI systems. And so there's a lot of funding that's going to these large technology companies in China as part of the war effort, the People's War on Terror. They also hire around 90,000 police. Many of them, the majority, are low-level police, often from the Muslim population themselves, whose job it is to sort the population at checkpoints and through scans of people's phones. Initially, the goal of this system is to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet, to figure out what people are saying, but then it becomes much more a sort of flexible enclosure system that has a material component in terms of with checkpoints. 1,400 tech firms are working in this space. It's really an incubator for Chinese technology development. And it's a lucrative thing as well. It's for a lot of the Chinese companies that are doing computer vision, getting access to state data, which is ID cards and all of the other sort of public information, is what really allows them to develop commercial products in a very short amount of time. And so having access to state data is really lucrative beyond the contracts themselves in terms of like money paid to build out the systems. And so there's a really carefully examined study that looks at a whole bunch of these different companies and shows that within 2 years, these companies develop commercial products after getting a state contract. Some of the things that were built are things to automate the transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech. This is one of the world's leading voice recognition companies called iFlyTech. And then most computer vision face recognition companies are also developing auto detection of Uyghur and Kazakh faces in surveillance video, which is one of the example here you see on the right. So it's really automating racialization by reading the phenotypes of someone's face. That is the goal of these systems. there's checkpoints everywhere. So when I went to the region in the last time in 2018, I went through so many of these checkpoints. This is built by China Electronics Technology Corporation, which is the parent company of Hikvision, which is the world's largest camera company. This is a state military contractor in China. And these are data doors that will collect data from the person's phone as they go through this checkpoint. You scan your state issued ID here, and then it matches your face to the image. It's really similar to a border checkpoint that we have here in Canada when you're entering the country from abroad, when you're going through customs. But these are at every jurisdictional boundary. So someone is crossing like an international border 5-10 times per day as they go about their daily life. They've also built surveillance hubs that are matched to grids of a policing system throughout the entire region. Over 9,000 of these. They're called convenient police stations, sort of on the model of a convenience store. And these hubs are staffed with these low-level police officers who are tracking movement within the grid that they're assigned to. You can see that the goal of the system, the purported capacity of the system, is that they're able to track people in real time. Everyone is searchable, and they can also look for patterns of movement over time as well. Of course, these systems are not like, build them and plug them in and then they start to work. They actually involve a lot of human labor in building the base data set for these systems. And so this is one of the forms that was used in those base assessments carried out by civil servants. Around 1 million civil servants were tasked with this kind of work. They're looking, figuring out what are people's age, ethnicity, employment status, passport, travel history, relationships to people living abroad. Number 5, 6, and 10 are really crucial ones because they have to do with religious knowledge. Did this person pray daily? Did they possess religious knowledge, which meant were they part of a WeChat study group where they were studying Islam? Had they ever studied Arabic or studied the Quran on their own? Had they taught their children about Islam or Uyghur history in their homes? Those are all part of this assessment. Everyone starts out with 100 points. Each category that applies to them results in a deduction of 10 points. And as points are deducted, they move from a safe or trustworthy category to an average category to an untrustworthy category. Many, many people, hundreds of thousands of people, were assessed to be untrustworthy. But it wasn't always through these initial assessments. I mean, some of these assessments were fairly accurate, I imagine, but most people would know that the right answer to questions about prayer and religious knowledge is no, I don't do those things. And so in order to really test the truth of this system, data valence tools were necessary, which came in the form of these kinds of tools, mostly built by a company called Mia Pico, which it turns out were built in reference to or building on software from Israeli companies such as Cellebrite, which is the world's largest sort of digital forensics company in the world, corporation in the world. These tools proliferated throughout the entire region and were used to scan people's phones. You plug them into the phone using a USB cable, and within a minute or so, it'll provide a reading of that person's digital history, looking for markers, in this case, of religious activity, terrorism activity, 75,000 different markers. Often, according to police officers who did these scans, the things that would show up or would trigger a red alert, which meant that this person was untrustworthy, was the listening to unauthorized religious teachings, being part of a religious study group, using a VPN, having WhatsApp, having content on their phone that had sort of religious iconography or religious connotations. After people were detected to be untrustworthy, both by the phone and through human surveillance, they're often sent to these types of centers, which are called vocational and training centers, closed, concentrated vocational and training centers, which in common speech in the region. When I was there in 2018, Uyghurs refer to them as re-education camps, using a term lager, which is the Uyghur word for concentration camp, from the German and the Russian. Everyone understood that these were prison spaces. You can see that they are, have high security fencing, very sophisticated camera systems. People are being held in cells. They're being transported with their, handcuffs. They're being treated as criminals. These are not schools, which is what the state would later call them. In 2018, we saw the state begin to talk about the camp system as a carrier of the economy, because it was attracting so many companies from other parts of the country, particularly manufacturers who are producing textiles. This is a source of cotton for the world. Around a third of the world's cotton supply is from this region. And so it makes a lot of sense that you would, source the production in the same site as the cotton is grown. It became quite clear through interviews and other forms of data that these workers are unfree workers, that they're not being paid, or they're being paid very little, and they have no choice but to do the work that they're assigned to do. Many of the people that first transferred from the camp enclosure to these factory spaces, sometimes the factories were inside the enclosure as well, were women. One of them was this woman, Gulzira Alkhan, who I interviewed in Kazakhstan after she managed to escape the region. She had a green card to live in Kazakhstan, and had her husband was in Kazakhstan. She had come back to China, which was her home country, to care for her mother, who was in ill health, and was detained upon arrival, found guilty of watching Turkish TV shows, traveling to Kazakhstan, having WhatsApp on her phone, being under the age of 55, all markers of her being potentially untrustworthy. She was held in a camp for about a year, and then transferred to this industrial park, which is about 8 kilometers from where she had been held before. And she recognized her boss when she arrived in this glove factory. This man, Wang Xinghua, who is here speaking to state media about the job creation program that he's in charge of in relation to the camp system. He's saying that the factory is very successful, generating $6 million in sales. He doesn't say, though, that he's paying the workers only around 300 yuan, which is $50 US per day, and then on top of that, a penny and a half per pair of gloves, which is like around a sixth of the minimum wage. It's way below standard. And Gulzira said, you can see that it's a kind of slave labor. That's how she thought of it. She told me that there were checkpoints at the entrance of the walled-off dormitory and factory where her ID and face were scanned. She said we would have our bodies and phones checked when we arrived and in the middle of the day. When we were leaving for the dormitory at the end of the day, they would check again because they were worried we might take a sewing needle. After we got to know the police contractors, we asked them, why are you still here watching us? They just laughed, never replied. The answer to this question was that the security workers were monitoring whether or not they were acting like submissive, re-educated industrial workers. Another former re-educated worker named Erbeket told me, we just had to smile and say, yes, yes, we were like pets. So what both of them are describing is a system of unfreedom, a system of that is facilitated by a sort of smart factory system that's highly securitized, producing a new kind of labor regime, a re-education labor regime that is, sort of right in between prison labor and factory work. One of the reasons why this is happening in this space is because it's a colonial situation where the colonized have really no means of resistance, no claims, no ability to claim their rights as citizens because they've been criminalized as terrorists. So what does this case in general sort of suggest? Well, what is happening here is a process of enclosure in multiple forms. Enclosure is the central component of original accumulation or primitive accumulation of capital. And in this case, the drivers are oil and natural gas initially, and then cotton, and then eventually the data and the labor of the colonized population in this space. It's established through a legalized regime of property claims and infrastructure, and a process of institutional capture. Part of what I'm trying to argue in my book is that this system should be seen as part of as a case and an example of the ongoingness of global processes of producing ethno-racial difference in order to build new frontiers of capital accumulation. And so, original accumulation did not stop in the 18th or 19th century Europe. It's ongoing. It's always going. New frontiers of capital accumulation are always happening. And in some cases, they're building, or they're linked very directly between colonialism and capitalism are linked very directly. Colonialism should be seen itself as a frontier of capitalism. I mean, maybe this is very obvious, but I feel like it has to be stated. I mean, there's a reason why the Hudson Bay Company is an important, realtor is an important purveyor of goods here in Canada. It's because it was at the vanguard of the colonial system in Canadian history. Okay, so a couple of claims that I'm trying to make. Terror capitalism should be seen as a particular frontier of global capitalism. There's many different kinds of capitalisms happening today. There's disaster capitalism, a response to climate emergencies. There's surveillance capitalism, which is about harvesting data, moving deeper and deeper into the mind and the body, through the Internet of Things, through biometric surveillance. And then there's the original accumulation argument of racial capitalism. I'm saying that terror capitalism is between these different forms of capitalism. I'm not saying that they supersede each other. I'm saying they coexist. And terror capitalism is pushing them in a different direction to think about new sequences of racialization that are associated with Muslim bodies in particular, through the production of the terrorist. But I think it's important to understand the terrorist as a sort of contemporary instantiation of older rhetorics of the savage, the barbarian, ways of delegitimizing the claims of people who are seen as other. This is not to advocate for violence or for terrorist violence. It's just to recognize that terrorism doesn't emerge out of a sort of a neutral system. It's a result of particular histories. So what's happening in China is ethnic difference is being racialized, terrorists is being produced as a population, and what it does is it renders an entire population detainable in a constant state of assessment, and in a ubiquitous system of status coercion. And here I'm building really on the work of people like Nicholas de Geneva, who's looking at North American context and the way that undocumented people are also made detainable or deportable. In this context, Uyghurs are not being made deportable, but the detainment aspect is happening. The second claim I'm making is that digital enclosures should be thought of as intimately linked to coloniality, contemporary coloniality. Historically, settler colonialism is about possession, domination, and occupation. Those are the three main components. Colonial possession is not only about capturing the material land, the property of people, it's also a process of eliminating or subtracting and then replacing an entire knowledge system and way of life. It's introducing the idea of property to begin with, and undermining existing knowledge systems. Domination happens through the capture of the institutions of the colonized, and for it to be a settler occupation, a settler colonial system, it has to have an occupation, which means that there has to be a population that lives in the place, and really is one of the primary reasons why decolonization is blocked. all three of those elements are in place in Northwest China. The digital enclosure system adds a fourth element. It produces a material and epistemic violence that is automated and scalable in more intimate ways, more banal ways than older colonial systems. So there's less of an outside to the system, and there's fewer ways to resist it. Even as you can, because things are being born digitally, we can detect them more quickly, but they're so ubiquitous that it's really hard to push back against it. The other thing that I'm noting here is the way that these systems travel or have the potential to travel. The technology companies in Xinjiang talk about what they're doing in relation to this. This is part of their marketing strategy, that we're doing this work in Xinjiang because it's opening up this huge market of Muslim populations everywhere. China's Belt and Road Initiative accounts for 60% of the global Muslim population. Belt and Road is a sort of new Silk Road development initiative that goes from Southeast Asia, the Middle East to Africa, and is part of China's primary sort of international development initiative. And so this spokesperson for the technology company says that because China is investing in all of these places across the global south, there's now a market opportunity that's huge and unlimited in terms of its potential, because there's Muslims in all of these places. And so wherever there's Muslims, there should be the kind of technology we're building here. That's the basis of the argument. And a lot of these technology is already moving to other places. Though I think this is not a very accurate sort of representation of the scale and density of these technologies. It's just showing sort of in a binary way. Yes, they have Chinese technology or they don't. Most of these places do not have it at anything close to the scale as what we see in Xinjiang. But still, there is harms being produced in many of these places. And my future work is looking at safe city systems down here in Malaysia, and the way that they're affecting stateless populations in the city of Kuala Lumpur. Most of the technology that's being exported is in terms of safe city systems, is being used for political purposes by local regimes, but not necessarily to colonize entire populations of people. That said, there is still ways that we can think about coloniality and the way that it moves through this technology or is linked to it. And I've been thinking quite a lot with other scholars like Samar al-Balushi, who's looking at systems in Kenya, to think about how new wars on terror that are not originating from the West are producing colonial systems or colonial logics in new places, that these things are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. In many of these cases, what's driving it is a sort of a business lobby from the nation where the technology is being built or being imported, and state-led venture capitalism, where the states are investing in this as well. They see war or counterterrorism as a space in which to develop proof of concept in terms of use cases, and then opportunities to export elsewhere. Part of what my work is trying to show is that in these new colonialisms, we're seeing new sequences of racialization, digital production of the other in action. Israel is a paradigmatic example of this new kind of settler colony, where counterterrorism is focused on settler occupation, domination, and dispossession. It's sort of the original colonial digital enclosure in the way that technology has been projected onto Palestinian space. An interesting element of this, though, is that because a lot of the technology used by Palestinians is coming from the West, from Silicon Valley, Israel does not have full capacity to control what people, or to assess what people are doing in space in a way that they can do in China, because in China owns the rails of all the technology. Still, I mean, what I'm trying to show here is that what Israel has done is a direct source of inspiration for what China has done to the Uyghurs. We see this in the policing documents and in the technology transfers themselves. And we also see Celebrite, the same company that is sort of the founder of the data valence that was done in China, selling the same tools to the Indian security to target people in Kashmir. And we see it being done in China. And then we see both companies, Mia Pico and Celebrite, selling the same kinds of tools to Russian security in 2018. Those kinds of tools are now being used in Russia as part of the filtration process to assess people from Ukraine that are being deported or taken to Russia and put through filtration camps. And so you see another kind of derivation of sort of counterterrorism. Here it's denazification, being used as a way of justifying colonial logic and utilizing the digital technology. There's many other examples I could provide. These are just a few of the sort of most obvious ones. It's also important to know that the same kinds of tools are being used here. They're being used in North America by police and border security to target populations that are vulnerable, particularly undocumented people. One of my collaborators, Carolina Sanchez-Bow, has been looking at the way that a private prison company called Geo Group has developed a app for asylum seekers that the security folks in the US are using, that forces asylum seekers to scan their face on a regular basis, to have their phones always on, tracking their movements, to give access to their social media accounts, to border security agents, so that they can begin to build a network of assessment of those people, to understand where they live, who they associate with. And so it means that the digital enclosure kinds of systems that I'm seeing in China are also here, not at the same scale. There's maybe 30,000 people that are being forced to use this in the US right now. But still, the logics are moving, not producing coloniality in quite the same way, but still the base of it is there. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you. Really interested to hear any thoughts you might have about any of what I just shared.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Thanks for all the work that you're doing in this realm. If anyone in the audience has some questions, just pop them into the chat. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the intersection of social credit scoring with the kinds of enclosure and subtraction that you mentioned. You got a little bit into the scoring, but can you say a little bit about how pervasive that social credit scoring is, and any other kinds of uses that it's put to?
Mm-hmm. Right. So the social credit score that I mentioned, or I sort of gave you that form that says trustworthy, normal, and untrustworthy, that's pretty specific to the Uyghur region in terms of what it's assessing. What it's assessing is sort of the loyalty of that person to the Chinese state, their political loyalty, and trustworthiness has to do with that in that context. Outside of the Uyghur context, and even within it, there's other credit scoring that's happening as well, which is more to do with sort of business credit, and the sort of credit score that most of us have as well, in terms of like whether we can get a loan or not, whether we're credit worthy. That's primarily what social credit is doing in other parts of the country. It's assessing whether this person is a trustworthy person in terms of whether you can loan them money. It's not questioning their political loyalty, because it's assuming that if you're a Chinese citizen and you're from the Han majority, which is the settler population in the Uyghur region, that you're loyal. Like that's not even something that has to be assessed. And so this credit scoring system that I was talking about is quite specific to this colonial context. At the same time, we also see, in response to the COVID situation in China and the until very recently, the zero COVID policy, that people were also being assessed in terms of their relationship to others that they saw as being COVID exposed, and rating them in 3 categories of green, yellow, and red, which is the same color coding that the Uyghurs were assessed by. So it's an ideological disease, which is how the state talks about Islam, versus an actual disease, a virus, but used in pretty arbitrary ways in China, which is why there was mass protests across the entire country, because they were locking everyone down. I guess what I'm saying is that there is a linkage. There's ways in which what's being used to target Uyghurs could be turned in other directions to target other people. For that to happen, though, there has to be a lot of human labor, people to man checkpoints, to scan phones, to do all of that sort of thing that they're doing to the Uyghurs to actually like implement the system, because you can see that like people will, unless they're forced to, or like there's a way of sort of actually excavating their data, they're not going to admit to things that the state will want them to say, to admit to. In some cases, so I mean, probably at the base of your question is like, you've heard about how like they shame people for jaywalking when they go across the street and say that this person is no longer trustworthy, or this person has littered in the neighborhood, and so they're no longer trustworthy, and then they get a big fine, or they're not allowed to travel in the high-speed rail car of the train or something. They have done this. So there has been in some places where the social credit system was piloted, they did assess moral behavior. So it went beyond the business sort of assessment. But I think that's not the norm. It seems as though most people wouldn't tolerate that kind of surveillance and that implementation of surveillance elsewhere in China. But it's too soon to say that it will never happen. It just hasn't really happened yet.
There's 2 great questions in the chat. I just want to ask one more question before we go there. You mentioned that the war on terror in China really amplified at around 2001, when the US started its so-called war on terror. And I'm wondering if that's one of the antecedents to this whole initiative, or in other words, how much did China draw from a war on terror discourse coming from the US? How much did China draw from like the quest for total information awareness that was popular in the US in the early 2000s as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. Absolutely, it drew quite a lot from it. So prior to 2001, Uyghurs were not referred to as terrorists. They were referred to as separatists, as wanting to have their own state, which historically they did have. In the 1930s and 1940s, they had an East Turkestan Republic. But then after 1949, which is the founding of the Chinese nation state that we have today, it was incorporated into China. And so there's that historical memory that informs how they think about Uyghurs. But the rhetoric of the terrorist allowed them to do something more than the rhetoric of the separatists. It allowed them to make Uyghurs appear to be foreign and illogical or irrational, infected by this disease of how they refer to Islam as an ideology of hate. And it also allowed them to begin to link up in allied ways with other states. So, part of the reason why they moved to call Uyghurs terrorists was because they were doing it sort of in response to the US war in Iraq and their support for that war, or the US wanting China's support for that war. So there's that kind of discursive kind of linkage. Then there's also like the rhetorical or the tactical and then the technological linkages as well. So you see in the Chinese policing theory and military theory literature that after the US occupation and other occupation of Iraq, the Petraeus Doctrine, which is counterinsurgency theory's kind of newest manual, had a big impact. And what Petraeus doctrine is trying to do, which is COIN, is map the entire population, break their social network, and as you're breaking social network, you do it by detaining the key leaders of the insurgency, and then winning their hearts and minds. So you see it in the policing literature that they're saying, like, we're doing the same thing, but with Chinese characteristics. And so, like, their reflex to move towards thought reform camps, which is what these internment camps are doing, is coming from the Maoist period, when they also did thought reform for counter-revolutionaries. But in general, though, it's mimicking the sort of leading military science when it comes to counterterrorism. And you see that as recently as 2017, they were welcoming people from Europe and elsewhere to come and give them advice on how to do counterterrorism better in China. And it moves beyond sort of military science to also policing science, which is the same that as we've seen everywhere, that the counterinsurgency theory has now been adopted by police departments in North America everywhere. And that's expressed in relation to Islam or to terrorism as countering violent extremism, which is a kind of preventative policing project. If you see people being radicalized, you should sort of grab them before it happens. And they say that they're doing the same thing in China, that they're just ramping it up at a different scale. We're doing it more full-heartedly than the Europeans and Americans. And then you see the technologies too, like, so here in Canada, we have our CMP and others using these data valence tools that collect all of these different streams of data that are being built by state contractors in the US. You see in the Chinese technology industry, you see them mimicking and saying, we need to build something exactly like this in order to keep up and also fulfill our mission in our own war on terror. So it's very closely linked. It's throughout. The technology companies are also, the leading CEOs are being trained by Western companies. They work in Western companies. They work for state contractors outside of China, at least in some cases. So they should be seen as one and the same. There is difference in terms of effect and scale and so on, but they are very closely linked.
Thank you. Let's go over to the chat, and I'll just say a little bit about the questions, but you can also read them, I hope. So the first one, do you see this process expanding to other Muslim ethnic minorities in China?
I mean, potentially, but not at the same scale or density. So Uyghurs are seen as the most threatening because they're the largest group and because they're a native group. Like, they claim their land as their ancestral land, whereas other groups like the Hui, they are sort of more dispersed across the entire country. They can pass as Han in terms of their racial phenotypes. They speak Chinese as their first language, so they're in general seen as much less threatening. They can travel to Saudi Arabia and come back and not be seen as like a security risk. Whereas if a Uyghur would do the same thing, they would be detained immediately. So we see them targeting Muslim leaders in those communities. There is a sort of anti-foreign Islam policy initiative that's in place in China, and so they're wanting Hui people to not adopt or circulate ideas that are not censored by the state. But they don't see them as nearly as threatening as the other groups.
Okay. The next question in the chat, could you please comment on the strange attitude among many leftists toward China's treatment of the Uyghurs? There's like this documented pattern of either conspicuous apathy or outright denial. Why is this tendency apparent among so many leftists, this tendency to ignore or actively deny China's repression of the Uyghurs?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I think it really has to do with global geopolitics and the way that this is framed by some as simply a sort of as part of a foreign policy tool being utilized by the United States, and others as part of the new Cold War, which is a sort of emergent rhetoric. And so the way that, and because some of the leading folks in the political system are that sort of advocate for Uyghur rights are coming from the right, coming from conservative positions, I think that leads leftists to want to just dismiss it as sort of a right-wing talking point and not something they should take seriously. I think a lot of leftists are simply very sort of cloistered into their own sort of domestic spaces. They're thinking about the world in very abstract ways. They haven't traveled to these places. They're susceptible to forms of propaganda or false news that they're immersed in online. They're suspicious of institutions like the New York Times. And so all of that means that they're just sort of missing the ground truth of what's going on. And they're quite callous to real immense atrocity. And I try to speak to those folks as much as I can, but there's only so much you can do. I think there's a lot more that educators can do in the classroom to help to sort of make people more aware about how they should approach this issue.
The next question in the chat: does your project intersect with work on necropolitics at all, and the idea of the right to live as it intersects with surveillance and the gaze?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't engaged Mbembe's work as much as I probably should have, but absolutely it intersects a lot. So I mean, he's thinking about a derivation of biopolitics, which is about the right, the making people live, the right to make people live, I suppose, and the way that death is also embedded in those kinds of systems. One aspect that's different in this context in Northwest China is they are making people live in a very particular way. I mean, maybe there's a kind of slow death that's implied by this, but they're making them stay alive because they want to put them to work in these factories. And so that's quite different from the way that race politics works in the United States, for instance, or in Canada probably as well, where it's more about excluding people from society by warehousing them in prison. Like there's also a warehousing happening in Northwest China, but it's a particular kind of warehousing of the body. It's in order to make it productive in a factory. They see it as a kind of proletarianization of them, turning farmers, turning the colonized into workers, which is not something that we see in other cases. Like in Israel, they're not turning Palestinians into workers either. They're just trying to limit their ability to live at all.
The next comment and question: do you have any reflections on the way that these kinds of devices of surveillance might be used in other places, and particularly conservative Muslim countries where it might be a Muslim regime insulating itself from secular citizens? Do you see these kinds of technologies, this kind of scoring being used in completely different political contexts at all?
I mean, so the Russian case is a sort of flipping of it, but I mean, it's just sort of the Putin regime that's making that flip available. It's not really true. Like they're saying that the Ukrainians are Nazis, that they're fascists, and like so they need to put them through this filtration process using technology in order to detect their like sort of right-wing tendencies. Just all of that is a totally false narrative. But it builds on a sort of a particular kind of history that's unique to Ukraine and Russia. I haven't looked at Iran to know enough about how they're using technology there. I know that many of the companies that I speak about in my work, like Hikvision or Huawei for sure, have a presence in places like Pakistan, and I'm sure in Iran as well. Safe city systems are being used there. Too, I'm very sure. And I think what they're doing is they're being used probably to quell dissent, so to stop protests in places like Iran. In Pakistan, they're being used, I think, to a greater extent to sort of target political opposition. In my new work in Malaysia, which is also a Muslim majority state, I see them being used primarily to exclude certain populations from having a right to the city. These are mostly stateless populations like Rohingya folks and Uyghurs and others, but mostly Rohingya. Around 180 to 200,000 Rohingya live in Kuala Lumpur, but are sort of pushed to the margins of the city, mostly through the surveillance and policing system. So they just simply sort of avoid the system altogether, which is similar to what undocumented people do in North America, that they avoid institutions like the hospital or the bank because they might be asked for their ID, and they're concerned that they could be apprehended because of that. Or they avoid spaces where there's face recognition because they think they could be on a watch list. That's the sort of thing that's happening.
What do you think the prospects are of terror capitalism kind of merging with disaster capitalism as we see more mass migration due to climate change? We see more mass migration due to other kinds of violence in the global south. Do you see something like terror capitalism emerging across whole borders, kind of separating the global south and the global north?
I mean, potentially. So yeah, there's that potential for sure. I mean, the way that the state is sort of framing terrorism is as a natural disaster, but it's a man-made one of these, like, that's carried out by this diseased population or something. They also talk about it as a public health initiative, using public health sort of framing too. When it comes to disaster capitalism, and so like even in the case I see in Malaysia, there like UN High Commission for Refugees is there as well, and they have a sort of countervailing surveillance regime, which is a biometric ID card system. Scans the refugees' faces or their irises, and then produces a QR coded ID card for them, which protects them from the other kinds of surveillance. And so that's sort of a disaster response kind of surveillance that's in place. I see also linkages in terms of camp systems too, like the internment camps I'm looking at in Northwest China, and the sorts of technologies used in refugee camps in the global south, but even more so in sort of holding areas in the global north where refugees are being held in places like Germany. So sure, I think there's a lot of linkages when it comes to sort of smart surveillance of the body, and how it can then be adapted for all of these different purposes. But there's so many different sites you could look at and ways you could think about it. So there's a lot to do.
Maybe just a couple more questions if you have time. You mentioned all these big tech companies in China, and they have apps. They're leaders in terms of surveillance cameras, facial recognition. Are there party cells in all of those large corporations? And can you say a little bit about the extent to which the state exerts influence over these companies through the party cells?
So you mean with the Communist parties? That's when you
Yes.
say party cells?
Yeah.
Yeah, most of them have some sort of, well, they have linkages to the party in multiple ways. If you're doing sort of computer vision technology, you're often, as a starting point, you start out doing state security. That's almost guaranteed. I don't know of any large computer vision company in China that hasn't worked in state security in some capacity. That's just the norm. In order to succeed in the Chinese economy as a technology company, you really need to work with the state. If you don't, you're setting yourself up for failure. You just can't work outside of it, really. And one of the ways that that's enforced is corporations in China are required by law to have a Communist Party committee within their corporation. And so there's Communist Party members that are sort of monitoring what the company is doing and reporting to the party. from inside the company. That's not to say that the party directs everything that happens in the corporation. A lot of what is actually happening is the corporation is not wanting to be audited. It's not wanting to like raise any red flags with the government. And so they're censoring themselves, they're censoring their users. They're building their own sort of censorship or surveillance capacity in order to accommodate what the state wants them to do, but they're doing it independently of the state. At the same time, they're also required by law to share all of their data with the state. So anything that happens on WhatsApp, or sorry, WeChat, is available to the government, and is in many cases being automatically assessed by the government. So in that sense, like there's no sort of privacy controls at all, if what you want to be private from is the government.
And just maybe one last question, if you have time. As someone who studies surveillance in these political contexts, have you yourself ever been pressured as a researcher, been under surveillance from different entities in ways that you're aware of?
Oh, sure. I mean, especially when I was doing research there, I was going through these checkpoints, being stopped all the time. At certain moments, they asked for my phone. You just know that basically all the material you have is really available to the state, that you are being watched. As being, some of it's human surveillance as well, being followed. But it's technological surveillance too. And interesting to go through these checkpoints and you see your sort of composite portrait being built on the screen because all the images from the other checkpoints you've been through are showing up again and again. So it is certainly tracking your movement. And sometimes in my teaching, I'll have people that I think are working for the state, observing. Sometimes it's in talks that I'm doing and so on. I don't see it as a major concern for my safety. I'm quite protected by the sort of citizenship status I have. My main concern is for my research subjects, that if I expose them inadvertently, it could mean something really serious for them back in China. And so that's my primary concern.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for undertaking these anthropologies and ethnographies of surveillance and investigating power and domination in these ways, and looking forward to reading a lot more of your work in the future.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a real honor to be here, and thank you for these great questions. Feel free to follow up if any of you have additional questions. I'm here. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.